other thing that I love about summertime, apart from spending more time in my little sewing den, is spending time outdoors, eating outdoors, picnicking, socialising, having good conversation, good food and maybe a glass of good wine as well. I'm going to make a placemat, so we're making our dining area outside a little bit more cosy and homely, but this is a practical placemat as well for two reasons. First of all, I'm going to put a pocket on the front, and that pocket is going to house my knives and forks or maybe napkins, and particularly if you've got plastic knives and forks, paper napkins, they tend to blow away in the breeze, so that's going to keep them in place. It looks good as well. And the second reason this is practical is that the wadding that I'm using or batting is insulated. You can see like it's got a silvery surface to it, so that's going to reflect the heat back away from my table. So if I put hot plates on that, there's less chance of my table burning underneath. So I've cut two pieces of fabric, one for the top, one for the bottom, and one from my insulated batting of the same size. Now measure these against maybe your table or the plates that you're using. Mine's 11.5 inches by 14 inches, but you can make this larger or smaller as long as it's the right size for your knives and your forks. It's not going to be too long that way. What I'm also going to do is pop a little pocket on the front, and that is one piece of contrasting fabric which measures about 5 inches by 9. But again, gauge that to the size of your napkin and to your knives and forks. And one thing that I'm going to do before we start sewing is to round off the corners, simply because it makes it easier to apply the bias tape, which is going to go all the way around. So I'm just using a ribbon holder actually. I've got all of my pieces lined up all together so I can cut through them all at the same time and just draw around the corners. Anything round will do. And then I'll just cut those curves. Don't worry about sewing through the insulated wadding either, although it's got this reflective silver coating. If anything, it's rather good for your machine because it'll help sharpen the needles as it goes through. Right. So the first thing we're going to do is actually sew the pocket on to one side. So I'm just going to double check. The largest implement I have is my knife, that's going to sit in the right place. And again, I'm just going to mark where I want the top of that pocket to go. Now this is a water erasable pen, so I'm not worried about marking on the top of my fabric because if I wet this, it'll disappear. You could use an air erasable pen or even a piece of chalk. So let's get sewing. Now to make the pocket, I've folded my fabric in half. I'll do that the other way around. And I'm going to sew around the 3 open sides, but leave a gap at the bottom for turning. I'm not worried about the seam allowance on this. I'm using around about an eighth of an inch on this one. Come down to the bottom of the corner, leave the needle in the down position so you can turn that around. And then I'm just going to sew across an inch or so, a few stitches backwards, move my foot across and carry on. And that's my gap for turning. And then we'll turn this the right way through. And then normally when I've turned this, I would press it, but just to make it a little bit quicker for you today, all I'm going to do is stitch across the top. I'm not concerned about the hole in the bottom or sewing the hole up, because when I sew the pocket on, that's going to be closed over. So I'm just going to push out the points. Be careful if you're using scissors to do this. They're not an ideal tool because you could go through. like so, and I'm just going to straight stitch across the top of the pocket for no other reason than it looks nice. And I'll line that up with the mark that I made on the front of my mat, making sure it's nice and square with the mat. And I'll just pop a pin in there to hold it in place, or two. And then I'm going to sew around the other three sides. Now, whenever you start your sewing, particularly if it's sewing pockets, always back tack a few stitches, and that'll help to stop the stitching from coming undone. So going down to the corner. That's my opening look, so I'm just going to tuck the two sides inside and sew straight across the opening. Into the second corner and back to the start. And then we put all the layers together. So my insulated layer is in the centre, making sure that my bottom layer is right side down. Line all of those up, and the top one is right side up. And I'm just going to pin that to hold them all in place. Okay. And then a long stitch, just a basting stitch or a tacking stitch, really close to the edge. Remember, I'm going to put bias tape all the way around the edge, so you're not going to see these stitches. But this is purely to hold all of the layers in place before I put the bias tape on. So take out the pins, don't need those anymore. And you may notice, particularly if you're using a regular wadding, a wooden wadding, or maybe a bamboo one, that it moves because it's very fibrous and it does tend to stretch a little bit. So at this point you can always trim that back so it's the same size as your fabric. That may happen. And then we'll pop the bias tape on. I think that should be fine. Just a little bit there. Okay, I'm going to start applying my tape from the back. Usually if I'm using bias tape, I'll apply it from the front, fold it over and hand sew all the way around. But I'm not going to wear this, it's only a placemat, so I'm not too worried if my stitches aren't quite perfect or invisible like they would be with hand stitching. So how are you going to do this if you haven't done it before? Open up your bias tape. This is a pre-bought bias tape, I haven't made it, so the two sides are folded in half to the centre. So you need to open this up and fold over the end, and that'll keep it nice and neat. And then pin this to the edge of your fabric or your project. I'm not going to pin this all the way around, but if it's the first time you've done it, you may care to do that. But then I'm going to sew it along that first iron mark there. The beauty of using a bias tape is that it stretches, because bias means that it's been cut on the 45-degree angle, and on woven fabric, which normally doesn't stretch at all, it gives it a little bit of give, which means that you can go around corners without it puckering. Like this. Now do stretch it, pin it if you want to, hand tack that first if that makes it a little bit easier. But the one thing you don't want to do is have any tucks of fabric underneath the needle. So just keep stretching as you go around the corners. Now when I come to the end, I'm going to overlap not quite that much, by around about 1/2 inch, and line up my ironed line with the line that I've just been sewing. That'll help to keep it neat. And again, if you've got any of your fabric that's moved a little bit, you can trim that down at this point. That will happen. Don't think that you've done something wrong. It just tends to move. Because the idea is now that your bias tape folds over to the front. So we don't want too much bulk around here, otherwise you're not going to get a neat line. So anything extra, trim it away. Particularly in the corners, you can see how the fabric's twisted a little bit. That's not a problem. Okay, so that's on the back side of my mat. Just take away the loose edges. And then we flip this over to the right side. And you can see where the bias tape now has stretched around that corner without it puckering or gathering. So again, I'll just take away my loose threads because I don't want to sew those into the seam. Flip that over. And when I'm top stitching, as I'm going to do now, I want to make sure that I don't see any of these lines from underneath. So make sure that when you fold this over, this is the side that you're going to see. It's hiding any of the stitches. If that looks as though I'm going to see some of those stitches, again, just trim back some of that fabric so it folds over and covers them. So now I'm just going to sew all the way around. And that's just about finished. All I need to do now is to give it a press with the iron. If you do find that your corners are curling a little bit, they will flatten out when it's pressed. I shall nip and do that in just a second. And then I think I shall go and get the barbecue ready, get the napkins out, have a nice glass of something cool, and invite some friends over.